Today I want to talk about the economy and what the coronavirus is doing to it. Now, when we talk about the economy, it's a very nebulous, abstract term. The economy, GDP, millions and billions. Substantively, what it means for most people is the high street. That's where you go and buy things. That's where maybe you had your first job. You might work there right now. It's the center, it's the heartbeat of local economic life. That's the experience of most people when it comes to the economy, their local high street. And what the coronavirus is doing to the local high street, as I'll go into detail, is effectively to congeal 20, 30 years of social economic change into about 12 months. The big story in the UK for 2020, I think, is this. And we've been talking about, the furlough scheme. Again, as I'll go into detail, almost 10 million people have seen their wages effectively socialised by the British state. That's never happened before. But that's deferred the crisis which is yet to come. So I want to detail, like I say, some of the numbers, some of the data, and what looks to be the leading edge of a hurricane, frankly. It looks like, actually, in all honesty, very few retailers, offline retailers, are going to survive. Very few outlets in hospitality, particularly sort of low budget dining, are going to survive. And you've got other sectors which will survive, but they'll increasingly resemble monopoly. You'll just have one operator that comes out of this the other side. The rest of them will go to the wall. That obviously has implications when it comes to wages, when it comes to consumer choice, but also it means when you're a monopoly, you can do a bunch of things in a market you otherwise can't do. So let's start with WH Smith. WH Smith have just announced they're going to allow 1,500 employees. They're going to shut dozens of stores. Now, WH Smith is an iconic British brand. We hear that all the time, but it's true. It's a couple hundred years old, I think. It has 500 to 600 high street outlets across the country. Employs approximately 14,000 people. So if WH Smith went, and I don't think it will, by the way, but if it went the way of, say, Woolworths in 2008-9, it's a lot of jobs, 14,000 jobs. Why are they facing such big problems? It's because their revenues are more than 50% down on last year. That's not a major surprise. The question is, of course, if coronavirus carries on, how many more jobs are they going to lose? To lose 1,500 so quickly suggests many, many more are to come. Now, WH Smith, okay, it's only one business. I barely use it, fine. And by the way, I'm really interested actually for people watching this in Britain. Small town Britain, or even small cities. Portsmouth, Halifax, Bournemouth, where I'm from. These places, I mean, if you live there, you know how important these businesses are because they are in every city, Reading, Glasgow, you name it. These businesses are in all of these places, right? And so it really can't be understated. If one of these goes, and we've had many of these businesses go in the last couple of years, haven't we? We had Woolworths in 2008-9. We had Borders, the bookstore. We've had British Home Stores. We've had Debenhams go into administration. We've seen closure of Marks & Spencer, House of Fraser. Since 2008, really, since the global financial crisis, we've seen, retail chain after retail chain shut down. And so what I really want to say with the coronavirus is that what it's doing is not bringing a new challenge to high street. It's just accelerating something which is already happening. Now, you might think, well, okay, hundreds of thousands of jobs are in this sector, they're going to be lost, but new jobs will be created. I don't personally believe that, but even if you do believe that, that theory doesn't work if all the jobs go in 1 or 2 years, right? That theory tends to work on the basis that an industry, effectively is rehauled, loads of labour is expelled, new sectors start up, more productive, they go there. But that's meant to take 20, 30, 40 years. It's not meant to take 12 months. So what do people do in the meantime? That's the big question, isn't it? WH Smith is just one of a number of retailers which has had big, big problems. The day before you had Hayes Travel. They laid off about 900 people. Again, Hayes Travel, maybe to some people in bigger cities or in London, or if you're not from the UK, Hayes Travel, never heard of them. This is the kind of place, small towns, small cities, they employ lots of people. Right? They will be a shop front in a high street. And all of a sudden that becomes an empty. They're not paying business rates to the council. They're not employing people. It might be vandalised. It changes the whole feel of the high street if you have lots of empties, right? It means the council has a lot less money if you have far lower business rates being paid. So it has big, big implications. They're laying off 900 people. It could be many, many more. Now, the idea of a travel agent, I mean, that's a bit retro, isn't it? We probably, again, it was going anyway. But what this confirms is that something which was going to take 10, 20 years is being accelerated. That's another one. What else we got? We've got DW Sports, Dave Whelan Sports, interesting guy, Dave Whelan. They're going to allow 1,700 people. gyms, sports outlets. Friday, Byron Burger. They're going to allow 650 people and close more than half of their outlets. Byron Burgers is kind of like the epitome of the post-2010 UK dining experience. Dude food, right? You didn't need immigrant labour because all of a sudden the Tories were being, let's be quite frank about this, quite xenophobic when it came to allowing, cheaper immigrant labour to come into the country. You can't afford an Indian or an East Asian or a South Asian cook. What, dude food? Anybody can cook that, right? Easy. So that was a big part of Byron and people like its success was the labour market being so significantly shifted after 2010. But it was also affordable. It was also fun. It was also very Instagrammable. And that's kind of seeing a nadir as well. That's also going away. You think, well, Byron Burgers, every single competitor in that particular field, I don't want to name all of them, are going to have the exact same problems. Why? Saturated markets, high rents, Brexit's going to push prices higher, and it's also going to constrict the labour market. You're not going to have so many EU nationals now that you can employ. So all of a sudden, they're facing big problems too. Monday, Pizza Express. They're saying that they're going to let 1,000 people go. They're going to be more or less looking at £1 billion worth of debt, which again goes to show this model is built on, hedge funds buying and selling these businesses, diffusing them across the country, right? Just opening up stores left, right, and centre. Actually, it turns out they weren't very profitable. They're going to lay off 1,000 people. So far, the hospitality sector this year's laid off about 17,000 people. Now, again, you might think 17,000 people, Aaron, you're just naming a few. This is with the furlough scheme. This is with the government socialising the wages for 10 million people. This is with, help out to eat out to help out, right? This with all this government intervention. That's before it's being withdrawn. And that's when they can, suspend rent payments and so on. The worry is, like I say, this is just the leading edge of a hurricane. It gets much, much worse. So what's the plan? What's the plan? If this is correct, if we're going to see potentially hundreds of thousands of high street jobs lost this year, what's the plan? The OECD is saying that Britain, if there's a second wave, is looking at 14, 15% unemployment. That's quite high. 14, 15% is unprecedented in recent history. It would have huge implications to tax take, has huge implications for business rates. What does that mean? It means the national deficit goes up, means the debt goes up, means local government doesn't have money to fund things. At the same time, the people out of work, well, they require, ideally, job seekers allowance. We don't really do that much universal credit. So they're not contributing taxation, but they're also, a drain, so to speak. They're a net loss when it comes to tax and spend, right? So 15% unemployment is pretty big. So you would think that our political class has some kind of solution. They're attuned to what we now need to do. And my worry is that just as we've seen with the health crisis surrounding the coronavirus, basically nobody's really had a plan. That's quite clear. The government, they announced their COVID action plan, I think in May, early May, and it became very, very clear that there wasn't really a plan. Like herd immunity, as my colleague Michael Walker has made expertly clear, was basically the strategy, tacitly, for at least a couple of weeks. We still don't really have a plan. Even now, track and trace and so on isn't actually as effective as it needs to be to work. And they're saying, well, we need to make that happen by September, by the time the schools reopen. So there's not a plan with regards to the public health crisis. My worry is it's exactly the same story when it comes to jobs, when it comes to employment. And people say, well, the ultra left will say, well, we don't want work. What? You know what? The only thing that's worse than having a job under capitalism is not having a job under capitalism, because it means you can't pay your rent. It means you can't buy the things you need to live. So what are the plans? What are our big politicians saying? Well, here's Keir Starmer. And of course, Labour's calling card has been jobs, jobs, jobs.
So I've been in Falmouth today talking to businesses, local communities about the challenges they face. This is a tourist town, lots of people involved in tourism, and they're worried. They've had a short season. Social distancing is causing lots of difficulties in restaurants and bars, and the public don't have the confidence. They are coming out, but not in the same numbers. And they're all saying to me, press the government, because the one-size-fits-all support package just isn't going to work. Sectors such as tourism need a bit of extra support at the tail end of this year, and that's what we're fighting for as the opposition. jobs, 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 and making sure the focus is on jobs. We're fighting for every job.
I just want to say very quickly, Labour are completely screwed, right? Right from the start, let's get this straight. Tourism, one sector, want a little bit more help at the end of the year. They want a little bit more help. Are you for real? We're seeing, major businesses every day saying we're going to lay off Pret, we're going to lay off 1,000 people. That, by the way, that was the amuse-bouche. That wasn't even the starter, right, for what's probably going to have to happen at Pret. And we have the leader of the opposition saying we want to give the tourism. And by the way, great. It's a really smart policy to say this about tourism. Let's have an extended furlough policy for tourism. Great. I totally agree here. But it can't be the only thing you're saying. And it is. And by the way, it makes electoral sense for Labour too, because this is going to go down so well in coastal towns, coastal cities, which Labour could and should win. Great. I get it. Makes electoral sense, makes economic sense. But when you're looking at this tsunami, right? Imagine you're looking at like a 50-meter tsunami. It's coming your way, and you're like blowing up a little rubber dinghy. That's basically what Labour are doing right now. And you're putting on your, your armbands, and you're putting on your swimming goggles. You probably need to act a bit more decisively. Okay. But like I say, give Labour their dues. It's something. It's a sector. It matters. Now, what does Boris Johnson say?
I want you to know that this government not only has a vision to change this country for the better, we have a mission to unite and to level up. And it's the mission on which we were elected last year, and we have a plan. And in advancing that plan now, I just serve notice that we will not be responding to this crisis with what people call austerity. We're not going to cheese-pear our way out of trouble, because the world has moved on since 2008. And we not only face a new and in some ways a far bigger challenge, and I can tell everybody, businesses, that next week the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, will be setting out our immediate plan to support the economy through the first phase of the recovery. But this moment also gives us a much greater chance to be radical and to do things differently, to build back better and to build back bolder. And so we will be doubling down on our strategy. We will double down on levelling up.
Rhetorically, this is what Labour should be doing, right? How tragic. You have Boris Johnson saying we will not do austerity. First of all, that just exposes how politically unnecessary or how politically motivated austerity was after 2010, but how economically unnecessary it was. Right? It was an ideological choice. It wasn't inevitable. That's the first thing it says. Secondly, it just let's put that argument to bed. By the way, I don't believe it, but a lot of people who voted Tory for the first time in December 2019, they don't want austerity. And he's saying and by the way, this will be focus group to death. Yeah? Focus group to death. So we're not doing austerity, and we're going to double down on what you've elected us to do. And this is an opportunity to transform the country. Labour is saying we want to extend furlough for tourism for a couple of months. Are you for real? So rhetorically, at least, and I don't believe a word he says beyond the rhetoric, rhetorically it's good. It's saying all the things it should be saying. But there's no real meat on the bone. And so I wonder, there's a huge opportunity if you look at the two major parties. Keir Starmer not doing very much. Boris Johnson talking a good game, but the economic crisis is far beyond the scale of the Conservative Party to resolve. And ultimately, they do have an ideological commitment to things like austerity. They are very averse to increasing taxes on them and their friends, which they will have to do. They're very averse to high rates of inflation. Why? Inflation's good, by the way, because if you have a high public debt, you can wind it down through inflation. They don't want that because, of course, that means the assets they own, often which allow them rental incomes, for instance, property and so on, that also is devalued through inflation. Inflation is not an enemy for working people. Inflation is an enemy for pretty wealthy people. We could do with a healthy dose of inflation. People say we can't go back to the 1970s. In that respect, it would be brilliant. It would be very welcome. Right now we're going to something else called deflation. I guess we'll probably come back to this in like a couple of months. But if you look at, like I say, the big sectors that employ huge numbers of people, forget aviation. I mean, that's dead. That sector is dead for 2 years. Forget, manufacturing, export-oriented manufacturing. A lot of those jobs are gone. We're seeing it, for instance, with again, aviation-related stuff, Airbus and so on. A lot of those jobs are gone. Or petroleum. Demand's going down. BP's laid off huge numbers of people. Banks laying off huge numbers of people. But ultimately, your high street's going to probably see as big a hit as anywhere else. Every single offline retailer faces a really, really major challenge. I don't think most of them will make it through 2020. Already, a few months ago, you were looking at payments of commercial rents of somewhere between 15 and 20%. I wrote about this in Enviromedia, right? So very, very few businesses are actually paying their rents. They're sitting on capital for as long as they can because they don't really know what's going on. And I want you to remember this. None of these people, Keir Starmer, Boris Johnson, certainly nobody in the government, the pundits, the talking heads, nobody really knows how this pans out. And I suspect what we're going to have to talk about before the end of the year is a fundamental rethinking of what our high streets and what retail looks like. That's what I think. And I think ultimately we're going to have to say, well, look, unless we want high streets and neighborhoods that look like they've been hit by a bomb, frankly, that they're empty, you've got broken glass everywhere, many parts of the country look like this, unkept, the council hasn't got the money to maintain roads and so on. Unless you want Britain's high streets to look like that, we're going to have a new kind of model. I've written an article about this in Enviromedia. I say that ultimately that's going to have to resemble something we call the Preston model. It's going to require massive state intervention. It's going to require huge infrastructure spending on things like broadband, public transport. It's going to require far higher levels of worker ownership. It's going to require really coming down on landlords. Landlords aren't just bastards when it comes to residential property, commercial property too, right? They can't keep on sucking the blood out of the rest of the economy, out of the rest of economic life. Everybody is producing wealth and they're taking such a huge share of it. That can't carry on. Labour should be saying these things, but they aren't. And my worry is if they don't, how do people think that this is going to be resolved? When they see all these businesses shut, when they see their high streets look so terrible, I think in the absence of that argument, things only go further to the right. So Labour needs to sort their act out. The left needs to really start articulating a message on this because let's be real, 10 million people are currently receiving wages from the state. That's never happened before. This is so unprecedented. And yet it feels like the ambitions that the left have are pathetically small. Boris Johnson's rhetoric is more ambitious than ours. It's not good, is it? It's not good. And that resentment and that anger will be channeled into a very, very, very negative place unless the left articulates that vision. Is that coming from the Labour Party? I don't think so. It's going to have to come from somewhere.